AI laws and regulations are emerging worldwide. Let's review what's going on now and how it may affect your personal and professional use of artificial intelligence. Welcome to Dave is Not AI. I'm Dave, an AI SME and an AI skeptic, looking at AI with a balanced perspective. Let's get started. So this video idea came from you guys. A couple of questions came in about some of the regulations that are emerging all over the world, and they are emerging all over the world, and what they mean and which ones are ones that need to be looked at, hard right now, how that's going to change our use of AI, either at the company level or a personal level, and if there are any legal exposures that we have moving forward. Now, keep in mind, I'm not a lawyer. I'm definitely not an international lawyer. And so ultimately, I'm not an arbiter of, what laws need to be followed and how they need to be followed. This is just learning. I'm teaching you what they are and whether or not they're going to have an impact or not. So first is the EU AI Act. It's a binding risk-based AI law that bans certain uses, imposes strict lifecycle controls on high-risk systems, and adds transparency and provider obligations for general-purpose foundational models as requirements phase in over time. So this is very typical of what we're seeing in the regulations. In other words, they're putting a large group of, probably unnecessarily ill-defined regulations around the use of AI. And obviously, people normally do this with the best of intentions, but ultimately they end up screwing some things up. And I think the EU AI Act is something that's going to do just that. So the EU obviously is looking to put these regulations on the providers, but also how you consume AI needs to be considered as well. So I urge you to go read the act, see if it's going to affect you or not. It's very much like the other ones that are out there. So in the United Kingdom, a principles-led approach where existing regulators, privacy, competition, sector regulators, apply current laws and guidance to AI, supplemented by frontier model safety and insurance initiatives rather than one omnibus AI statute. So what they're doing now is not necessarily trying to build a law in the UK, but they're using something that's a bit less scary, a principles-led approach. And what they're doing is they're looking at the existing regulators and the existing laws that currently exist in the UK and looking at how they're going to be applied to the use of AI in the UK. I think this is pretty common sense. Obviously, the existing laws are going to apply, to use of any kind of technology, specifically AI. But what they're doing is basically mapping what that means to the use of AI, the foundational models, all these sorts of things that are starting to emerge, copyright issues, slander issues, leveraging, LLMs for scams, things like that. So in the United States, the federal level, there's no single AI law yet, and AI is governed through agency guidance, procurement rules, and enforcement of existing statutes, consumer protection, civil rights sector rules, things like that, applied to specific AI use cases. And again, this is very much like the UK regulations that are starting to emerge. Instead of building up a bunch of new regulations and laws that have to get through Congress and be signed by the president, they're just putting guidance and rules and principles around the existing laws that currently exist and how they map down to the use of AI. And I think that's going to be fairly helpful. It's probably not good that many countries and many states in the United States, things like that, are starting to create laws and regulations that govern the use of AI. I understand why they're doing it. Again, best of intentions, but the reality is they're going to end up screwing something up and, break some glasses, so to speak, when they start putting restrictions around how people are going to be using AI. And they typically, don't understand about the evolution of technology. The technology gets better, grows into different directions. And the laws that they've written just a few years ago are very difficult, to apply. Very much like the growth of the internet in the late 90s. There were lots of laws and regulations that came out in terms of ways in which we can manage and reduce some of the risks of the internet. But of course, the internet technology grew way faster than the lawmakers could anticipate. And they ended up making lots of laws and regulations that had to be rescinded because they were just too archaic. So what about the United States overall? Well, there's a rapid growing patchwork of state laws focusing on disclosures, deepfakes, synthetic media, privacy, biometrics, and guardrails for consensual decisions like hiring, housing, credit, and insurance. And we'll go over each one of the states specifically, but the idea here is that many of the states in the United States are trying to get their specific rules and regulations that are going to control how you hire people and, scam artists and deep fakes and, all these other things that are starting to arise as a concern. Again, the problem with that is that normally the lawmakers are going to be way behind what the technology can do. And so they're making laws in 2026 that are going to be implemented in 2027. And by the time we get to 2030, the technology's already cycled many times over, and the laws are going to be archaic and not necessarily applicable to the new range of technologies. But they're all going to try. I think, again, good reasons. They have good intentions. I just think that the way in which they're going to be implemented ultimately over time is not necessarily going to be helpful. So what about the specific states? Well, California combines strong privacy governance, its CPRA and CCPA, with active AI bills, rules targeting transparency, automated decision impacts, and the synthetic media deception harms, making it one of the most aggressive U.S. states that are out there. And these rules are so aggressive that many companies, if they're going to be implemented, are going to end up moving out of state. And you got to remember that's going to be the problem with all of these state rules and regulations. Normally these companies are multinational companies, they're multi-state companies. And if they view these laws and regulations as being a threat to the way in which they want to do business, in other words, there's a risk there, that's going to harm their business. They're going to find it. They're just going to relocate out of state. And I think the state regulators, who are making these laws, rules, principles, whatever, don't necessarily see that. They almost think like the companies are not going to move out of state. They're going to comply with the laws. Believe me, if these laws get in the way, they're gone. They're just going to move across the border to Nevada or something else like that. So Florida uses targeted statutes, not a single AI act, that affect AI mainly through privacy, consumer protection, and restrictions on deceptive or harmful use of synthetic media in sensitive contexts. So this is the do no harm, kind of rules and regulations where they don't want you to weaponize AI as something that's going to be deceptive advertising, scamming, all that kind of stuff. Someone calling up a member of your family and simulating your voice using an AI chatbot and natural language processing to, carry off some nefarious thing. And so obviously there's existing rules and laws against that. It's called fraud. And however, what they're doing is just basically trying to map the existing thinking and what the laws currently mean in the context of AI. And again, in the case of Florida, it's just for Florida. I view the Florida stuff as pretty innocuous, certainly compared against the California laws and regulations that are starting to emerge, but the same, issue applies. In other words, if companies view the Florida regulations, and I don't see how they could, currently the way they're written, as being risky to themselves or depleting their revenue in some way, shape, or form, they'll just move out of state. And typically the lawmakers don't anticipate that. They'll make tax rules, just like they did in California. And people will respond to it because it's dynamic thinking, and they'll adjust whatever they need to adjust so it's not necessarily going to affect them. Obviously, in many cases, if there's federal rules and regulations, they're not normally going to move out of the country. They'll just comply with the rules. But the ability to change states in the United States is fairly easy. And so they'll just move. So anyway. So Canada proposed federal AI rules, AIDA, aim to regulate high-impact AI with documentation, risk mitigation, monitoring, and potential penalties on top of Canada's existing privacy obligations that shape AI data use. And again, same sort of idea again. They're going to, look at the risk in doing it, how to deal with documentation, monitoring, AI monitoring of particular individuals or the government or businesses, and then putting clarifications in terms of how the existing Canadian laws are going to map directly into the use of AI. So there's no unambiguous, understanding, which I think is good because people are going to ask, is this illegal what I'm doing, and creating, custom marketing content that's, able to drive more viewership that's customized for the particular individual that's looking at my website, for example. Well, in some cases, we understand why you're doing it. You're trying to drive more sales within your website using recommendation and just things like that. But there obviously has to be a limitation on how you're going to be leveraging AI to make sure you're not violating the privacy of somebody, or you're not getting, too deep into gathering their PII information directly from recommendation engines. Someone who's built a dozen recommendation engines for different retailers over the years, I can tell you that you end up gathering a lot of very personal information about people with using these AI systems. We can tell based on behavior and how someone's using a website, what products they're looking at, things like that, demographics, age, income level, race, all that stuff becomes apparent. And obviously, some of that stuff is legit. In other words, I'm able to target recommendations that are aimed at a particular demographic, age, race, things like that. However, there is a threshold where you're stepping over into privacy violations, gathering PII information, things like that, which you can do with many of the AI systems right now. So they're trying to, in essence, set a standard that companies should follow. But again, typically these are international companies, and if Canadian rules, the American rules, or the UK rules, or the EU rules get in the way of their business, at the end of the day, they have the option of moving to another country. Countries that don't have these laws and regulations, and you got to remember, we're typically deploying these systems in a multinational situation. Everything's an international market now. Those options are always going to be there. So it'll be interesting to see if businesses end up moving and adapting to different regulations as they emerge. Right now, I don't see them getting in the way of much. I see them interesting and, kind of mildly annoying, to people who are trying to build businesses. But largely, I think the regulators have been a bit more hands-off with the AI stuff, understanding that the latency is something they can't anticipate. In other words, putting rules and regulations in place and having the technology, rev a couple of times and having those rules and regulations being meaningless because the technology has bypassed them. And so they're a little slow in getting these rules and regulations out. And I think that's probably by design. I don't see a lot of regulations and laws that are emerging around the use of AI, having the teeth I think people think they're going to have. So obviously, the AI juggernaut is full, is full speed, and they have lawyers and lobbyists, all those sorts of things ahead of it. And they're normally, kind of help shape these rules, laws, and regulators. And so we'll see where it goes. Well, anyway, that's my tour through laws and regulations around AI and internationally and here in the States. So don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn Learning courses, and of course my Generative AI Architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Take care, guys.